welcome to Book World, The Great Escape. I am author CJ Peterson with my co-host, I did it correctly this time, author Michael Scott Clifton, and we're here talking about story length today. So that's kind of a huge topic, but before we get there, Mike, how was your week?
Well, it's pretty good. My wife Melanie went on a European trip, kind of a lifetime with her sister. She got back on Monday, so everything's safe and sound. So that's great, and a little bit of jet lag, recovering now, but I think she's about over that. I spoke to the Lions Club last Wednesday. Kind of gave them an overview of where publishing was nowadays, about a little bit about indie authors, how we work, how we operate, what the definition is of one. And I thought they were pretty interested. I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to them. So spring's been kind of slow for me, a little bit busier for you, I know, CJ, but I've got some events that are starting to happen. So next 2 weeks, April the 1st, we'll be doing Dalton Days in Longview. And then the next week, we'll start the Longview Art Walk, which they have quarterly, which is in the historic downtown portion of Longview. Always enjoy that. Myself and several other indie authors, usually we're in the Verabank lobby, and we do quite well. And so if you're in Longview on Thursday, April the 6th, look us up. If you're in Longview on April the 1st, which is a Saturday, which is in old downtown Longview as well, look me up. And so that's it. And I'm 2/3 of the way, a little over half, through my next novel, which is a standalone called Pringle Prawn.
So, ooh, and what's that about?
What's that?
What's that about?
It is about, I knew you were going to ask me that, CJ. So Pringle is a prawn.
That I kind of got.
Yeah, which she is a forest fairy, a forest prawn. And the main character is dropped into her world quite by accident, which happens through kind of a mysterious key that unlocks a gigantic grandfather clock. Let's leave it like that. She helps him to get back to his own world, including saving his life. And unbeknownst to him, she follows him back to his world, which is present day East Texas, Tyler, Texas. And the tagline I think I'm going to use on that, I may change it, is a very fairy adventure. So something like that. But it's a fun book. I've enjoyed writing it. And like I said, I hope I'll have it out late this summer and ready for the fall.
Very cool. Well, for me, we did Comic Conroe, not last weekend, but the weekend before. So that was super fun. Got in lots of trouble with Magic Making Mischief and Mombirola. The next one we're going to be doing is the 31st of March to the 2nd of April. It's like pop culture something or other. I'll tell you. Well, actually, we won't, because you won't be here next week. But it's like pop culture something. It'll be fun. We'll review it. And then we have Chautauqua Festival on April 15th. And then we have the NetWo
Writers Conference.
The last weekend in April.
29th of April.
Yep. And I believe both of us are speaking, which will be super fun. Correct?
Well, I'll be a participant. I'm also running on the coordinator of the NetWo First Chapter contest.
Oh,
so
nice.
we're presenting the winners at the spring conference, NetWo Spring Conference.
Very cool. And that's at the last weekend, I think, in April.
Right.
And then Kilgore Geekend is the first weekend in May. And then we're heading into full tilt Comic-Con season. So super fun and exciting. Lots of things to do. I'm working on my book, which will be hopefully heading to the editor in May or June. It's Tested by Fire, where a fire marshal falls in love with an arsonist before he realizes she's the arsonist.
Interesting.
Moral dilemmas all over the place. Kind of my favorite type of writing. So today we're going to be talking about story length. Story length, sometimes people like me It's like you just go with the flow, and whatever comes out is what comes out. Some people, like a lot of times, the planners are more like we talked about before, where they're like, I have to have this amount of words per day. That gives pantsers hives. But you found a really cool article. You want to tell them about it?
Well, when you're doing research on today's podcast about story length, I of course do what everybody else did. I Google surf, and Kindlepreneur, which is something I have a subscription to, and I think you may have one as well. Helps you with your Amazon ads and marketing and that sort of thing. Had a tremendous article on book length, and not only on book length, but the other aspects of the genres and how it affects book length and sales. And I urge everyone listening to go to that link. It has pretty much in an encapsulated form everything you'd want to know about word length or word count on all the various genres and subgenres.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I
have one of the charts up. For those who are listening, it kind of basically gives a brief overview of the average. So do you want to talk about that one?
So this, when we talk about genre, fantasy, science fiction, romance, etc., but there are other kinds of categories of books, and these are those categories: adult fiction, young adult, middle grade, and first chapter books, even down to picture books for children. And they give you the word count. So you see, like on adult fiction, it starts from 50,000 plus, generally between 50 to 90,000 words. And then young adult starts at about 45,000 to about 80,000, middle grade, 22,000 to 60,000, and so on. These are all figures you could look up on the Kindlepreneur website, or article, I should say. But they give you a pretty good idea if you are a children's book writer, if you are an adult fiction writer, gives you a pretty good idea of what you should shoot for in terms of word count. Now, another interesting aspect of that article, CJ, is that there's always exceptions. Okay. Just because the average word count is whatever it states it should be for adult fiction, children's picture books, etc., doesn't mean that a book won't sell if it falls outside or inside of that word count range. There are exceptions. But if you're a new author and you're just starting out, you would do well to behoove these word counts in terms of the genre and the type of book that you are writing. It'll give you a pretty good target to shoot for in your final word count for your novel.
I just put a new chart up for those who are listening as well as those who are watching, and it gives you kind of the average range of most books on Kindle and where they fit within the genre. And that's what Mike was mentioning.
There's also, sometimes you may wonder, okay, what's the difference between a novella and a novel, or a novella and a short story? Do we have a...
Yes, I actually found a chart for that one.
Okay.
There you go.
So novellas are generally going to fall 40,000 words or less. They're going to go between 10 to 40,000 words, or 20,000 to 40,000 words for a novella. A novel generally has to be more than 40,000 word count in length. Generally, to be classified as a novel and not a novella, you need to have a word count that exceeds 40,000, probably closer to 50,000 word count. So it's important to realize that a 40,000 word count manuscript is in fact not a novel, not considered a novel, but a novella.
Correct. And you got to watch the amount of word count versus the size of the book itself. As we were talking earlier regarding publishing, the standard is 5.5 by 8.5. That's your standard size book that looks just like this one. just your standard size book. On that, the standard page length versus word length, the average, will depend on what you're shooting for. But when you get into those smaller word counts, like for example, this particular, like I showed you, this is the average book. So when I put it on top of a smaller book, this top one is a novella. And it actually also has a bonus short story in it as well. So there are actually 2 stories in this one. And as you can see, the spine is pretty small. There was one I was trying to do earlier where the spine would have been non-existent by the size. So it depends on what you're wanting to use it for. So for example, if you're trying to tell a story to make a point. For example, one is trying to help them through grief or through domestic violence or through whatever. You might be okay with a shorter microfiction or flash fiction size book. I wouldn't recommend it, or a short story. I would stick more with the more the better regarding some of that, because you can touch certain areas with more words than with less. But I would not go any smaller than the short story size of 7,500 words with those. And even then, it's going to be a pamphlet with absolutely no spine. Now, if you're wanting to tell an actual story, yet still kind of apply it that, I would shoot for between the short story and the novella size.
So a short story, again, these are generalities. There are exceptions to them. Can be anything from 1,000 words to 10,000 words in length. And another thing I think we need to mention here, we may have some nonfiction people that are nonfiction writers, nonfiction authors. The general length of a nonfiction, this is just, market generality, is between 50 to 80,000 words. So nonfiction books are generally a little bit shorter in word count than fiction novels. They're a little bit smaller, a little bit less in word count than a fiction novel.
Now, we also have another chart up here that's regarding word count and fantasy, kind of your average that I believe they're trying to get you to shoot for is in the orange if you're looking at this. If you're listening and you want to check out these charts, make sure to go to our YouTubes. Mine is CJ Peterson. Mike's is Michael Scott Clifton, correct?
Right.
So you can find those charts there and kind of just rewind the show and find what your targets are. But it was really good information. The article that we used for some of these charts is actually in both the Facebook group as well as the YouTube.
And the orange there signifies this is based on sales on Amazon. Okay, so the orange represents 50% or more of sales on Amazon. So, and the blue, it's 25% or less. So you can see the range there is pretty well self-explanatory. When the word count falls far short of what the average is, or if the word count falls way ahead of where it should be, the sales go down. And that was another thing that the Kindlepreneur article had 2 or 3 different pointers, which we talked about a little bit before the show, which I thought were very interesting. And we talked about one of them, which is word count affecting how many pages will be in your book, your trim size, and of course that will determine the cost of printing your book. And the more pages, obviously, the higher the word count, the more expensive it'll be. But also, readers who follow certain genres, romance, science fiction, fantasy, mystery, thrillers, they know the kind of word count, they know the length of book that they like. They are intimately familiar. They've read many books in that genre because that's their interest. And if your book, your word count is much larger or much smaller than what they're used to, they're probably not going to buy the book.
Correct. So your average is about that size. However, when you start to dip into something like sci-fi or fantasy, you can see the difference in the width of the spine, which means the difference between the width of the storylines.
Right.
Which we talked about as well. that the sci-fi fantasy has about 15% more word count than the average.
It's generally higher, obviously. And of course, we've talked about this in previous episodes. It's because world building is a big part of science fiction and fantasy, and you have to spend a little bit more time building those worlds, which of course is going to add to your pages and your word count.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But it's, part of that is the planner versus pantser stuff. You have a target as a pantser, and a lot of times, if you can hit that target, then you know that you've reached where you need to be. But the pantser in me sees that and kind of gives me hives. So any advice for somebody in that position?
Well, even a pantser like you or I, we do have a general idea
Mm-hmm.
of the length of the book and number of pages.
Mm-hmm.
It just may not be nailed down exactly, which with a planner, given that they've done all their work ahead of time, their word count's probably going to fall within, probably a couple hundred, maybe even 1,000 or so words of what they have already predetermined, right, based on their planning. And there's pros and cons, and we've talked about that also in previous episodes. Planners actually do most of their work previous to writing their novel, and so it's easier for them to start from point A and get to point B, whereas pantsers like ourselves, we have a general idea, but nothing's nailed down, and it sometimes takes off in directions we don't even know, which may make the length of the book longer or shorter, as the case may be.
Yeah, and for example, like the NaNoWriMos, I can't
remember
the Nano
NaNoWriMo.
month.
Yeah, I never can pronounce it right either.
November. That gives me hives as well, because someone's like, "Oh, I did this amount of words, and I did this amount of words," and I'm just like, "Okay." Like, well, how about you? I just write, so I might give them hives when you start to think about it, and it's like, but we were talking about that sometimes when you push too much for your writing, it suffers the quality versus the quantity.
I think the original purpose of NaNoWriMo, or the reason why a lot of writers do that, is it forces you to write,
Mm-hmm.
and whether you've come to a point in your writing career or things in your life that may happen that have sort of interrupted your writing schedule, it forces you to get off the pot, so to speak, and to start writing, and jumpstarts, to writing. And I think that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But it does require you to write so many words at a minimum, forces you to do that, which there's pros and cons to that. We could probably spend a whole podcast on that. So I'll just leave it at that. But it serves a good purpose for lots of writers.
Mm-hmm.
But quality versus quantity is always going to be kind of a part of the discussion on that type of writing. So
one thing that I would challenge people is if they've hit a rut and they're not sure where to go, something happened in their life, and as a writer they don't have the inspiration to do it. I would challenge you to write a short story, 3,500, 7,500 words, just a short story, and you never know, a book may come out of it, a novella may come out of it, you don't know, a series may come out of it, but kind of to boost yourself up and get yourself out there, that's not a bad thing to do once in a while. And sometimes people are like, what do you do if you have writer's block? Well, unfortunately, I don't tend to have writer's block.
I don't either.
But if I do, a lot of times I find whatever inspired me in the very beginning to write said story, whether it's most of mine are songs. Like, I can tell you which song came from which book and which one inspired which books. And when you can find out what makes those wheels turn in your brain, or, also known as make your muse talk or whatever, that helps you to gain insight as well. Just sometimes that muse needs to pull back because sometimes you end up writing a million count word book like you did in the very beginning, and you need to cut them down. Otherwise, you end up with the publisher going, that's too long. We need to cut out about 3/4 of it or break it up. So word count does matter. Size does matter. And when you're dealing with or working with readers who are used to a certain size, like you mentioned earlier, the average size book, when they go to pick up another one, they may not pick up a book that's thicker because they don't feel they have time, or that's not what they're used to.
The other thing, and I just thought of this, is if you're wanting to get your print books converted to audiobooks,
Mhm.
word count also definitely affects the price of an audiobook. It affects the cost, especially if you're using ACX, Audible, which is owned by Amazon,
Mhm.
to get your audiobook done. The larger the word count, the more per finished hours it would take a narrator to finish your book, which of course is going to increase your costs vis-a-vis your narrator. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. So, but word count, one thing about the word count, which again, if you're interested in this, go to that Kindlepreneur article. It's not that long. It's very informative. And just read through it. But one of the points they made, which we've already talked about, but I want to emphasize, is that word count is a target. It's not a hard and fast rule. A book can exceed word count or be less than word count and a bestseller. It doesn't have to fall within that range. But generally speaking, different genres have different word counts, which readers come to expect, but not always.
Correct. And there's a lot of points in here. We were talking about it earlier regarding like the size for fantasy, the size for romance, the size for horror. And horror is actually up there as far as word count as well. It's actually higher as far as like the fantasy. It's up there with the sci-fi and the fantasy. And part of that we talked about has to do with the world building.
One of the examples we used, as a matter of fact, on the horror was Stephen King's book, The Stand, one of the all-time bestsellers. And it had a word count over 500,000, 500,000 word count. And so it was far out of the so-called average range of what falls within.
That's a lot of words. I want to know how they got that down to well, actually, that one ended up being a miniseries.
Right.
So that was even a movie. That ended up being a miniseries.
And I haven't looked up what the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's, work, but I'm sure it exceeds the fantasy word count by quite a bit. As do a few of the authors, fantasy authors. So, but again, if you're a beginning author, okay, and you're shooting for a word count, it's a good rule of thumb to just look at that article.
I actually found the word count for them.
Did you?
I just did just now. And it is the Fellowship of the Rings. It was 187,790 words. The Two Towers was 156,198 words. The Return of the King is 137,115 words. The entire Lord of the Rings series, including the Hobbitses, were 576,459 words.
Whoa.
So all of those words put together make it or the stand. That's a lot of words.
And I read The Stand. It's and I've told you this before, CJ, it's one of my all-time favorite books. One of the few I've actually read more than once, which is quite a few, which is saying something, because I can count on one hand and have most of my fingers left over all the books I have read more than one time. And The Stand was one of them.
So anybody who wants to write a story that has to do, and they're worried about the word count, what advice would you give them?
Well, if you're a beginning writer, you definitely need to look at the target word count for your genre. If you're looking to try to get it traditionally published, doubly so, since the publishers are looking for the word count that, and if it exceeds, and we talked about this earlier, exceeds our or falls short, they'll use that as an excuse to toss it out. So it's a good rule of thumb to follow, which gives you an idea whether you're a pantser or a planner or somebody in between on where you should fall in terms of your word count, particularly beginning writers.
Definitely. And for those who are watching or who are coming back and rewatching it from the beginning, this is the reference that's used for the graphic count, as well as the article that we used some of this from. It's the HTTPS kindlepreneur.com, how many words in a novel. Again, you can go to our YouTubes. Mine is, let me find it real quick. I'll do yours first because it's right here. Yours, Mike's is youtube.com/C/Michael Scott Clifton. Mine is youtube.com/C/CJ Peterson. And you can go and you can find those charts. You can kind of flip through them and take a look at them. It's not really, it depends on if you're a planner or you're a pantser on what, or formulaic versus from the heart writing. And all four of those categories will depend on how you're going to write your book. Either way you write it, write the book that you want to read.
Exactly.
That's kind of where I'm at, because there are exceptions to every one of those rules. But if it's too small, it won't be seen. So you might as well not even publish it. So make sure that what you're writing it for fits the target that you're trying to hit. That's my advice to you.
Know your audience.
Well, Mike, it was a great topic as usual. Next week, we do not have Book World, The Great Escape. I can't remember why, but we don't. And then April 5th, we'll be returning. We'll be talking about anthologies. Those are fun, and those are some untapped sources for really good stuff. So make sure to catch us not next week, but the week after on April 5th. We'll be talking anthologies. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on our YouTubes. If you miss it, make sure to check that out. If you are a listener, make sure to favorite or follow your favorite podcasting platform so you don't miss a single episode. In the meantime, everybody have a great week. Stay safe with the lovely weather that's been bouncing around.